I'm so glad that you joined me. My name is Heather Lindahl. I work in the Literacy and Lifelong Learning Department. I'm here because this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. It's hard. It's hard work. So I appreciate you coming here to talk about a situation that has been with us for a long time. It's still present, and we have to look at it in order to change it. And so thank you for coming here today and joining us and looking at a very serious issue going on in our society. But there's a big message of hope in there too. So I just wanted to express my appreciation for that. So I'm joined by Nell Bernstein, who's zooming in from California, who has written this incredible book, In Our Future, We Are Free, The Dismantling of the Youth Prison. And also Patrick Keenan-Devlin from the Moran Center here in Evanston. Both of these professionals have dedicated their lives and their careers to looking at and fighting for youth that are being oppressed by the state. So I'm going to let them describe Nell's going to talk about her research in a little bit more depth, and Patrick's going to tell you what is going on here locally in Evanston to address these issues. A lot of really good things are happening. There's still, the horrors persist, but so do we. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over, and then we'll have questions. I have questions I'm dying to ask them, and if you have any questions to ask, please go ahead and jump in when we get to that part. Okay. All right. Hi, Nell. Were you able to hear me okay? I just realized I was turned away.
Yeah, I feel like I was there.
Okay, great.
Patrick, good to meet you. Yeah, I think I'm looking at your windows from my table in California, and it looks cold. So I don't know if it's what you guys call cold, but I appreciate anyone and everyone who came out in the cold to hear about this. It is a difficult topic. It's my second book on the subject. This one, to my great astonishment, is hopeful. Because when Heather first reached out to me a few months ago, this book, In Our Future, We Are Free, hadn't been published yet. It just came out next week, and she and I spoke about my last book, Burning Down the House, which honestly, that book was written in a white heat of rage. I had spent several years as a reporter going into youth prisons, talking to many, many young people who'd grown up in them. And the things that we do to children in the name of public safety were so overwhelming to me that I sort of ditched my reporter's training and wrote something that I now see as half polemic, half journalism. This book is different, but my anger and my inspiration for both books really are rooted in, I don't know, personal experience, secondary experience, whatever it is. I had lost several young people I cared about to youth prisons by the time I started reporting on them. And I started my career, gonna date myself here, editing a youth newspaper in the Bay Area in the 1990s, which was the super predator era. It was when youth incarceration was at its height. And it just was not that unusual for one of my staff to get arrested on their way to our downtown office. And every time that happened, I put on my little Ann Taylor suit purchased for this purpose and went and stood next to them in court. Sometimes, if I was allowed to, spoke for them. And then when that didn't work, I would go visit them in juvenile hall. And when things really went south, I would correspond with them when they were sent to the California Youth Authority, our now defunct state-run youth prison system, which back then was the largest in the country, with 10,000 kids in what a court-appointed monitor whom I interviewed for this new book described as medieval conditions. He used the word dungeon to describe them. So if you had asked me then if I would 25 years later come bearing a message of hope about youth incarceration, I don't know if I can't say I would have laughed. I just would not have understood what you were talking about because these places were so entrenched culturally and politically that the most I could imagine doing was maybe helping to keep a kid or two out of them. The notion that they would close down one day, that just wasn't even on the radar. But here we are. And this takes me to In Our Future We Are Free. At this point, youth incarceration in this country is down 75% from its 2000 high. At least two-thirds of our nation's youth jails and prisons have closed their doors entirely. I'm guessing that's more by now. And despite fears that the opposite would happen, there has also been an 80% drop in the number of young people prosecuted as adults. So we really have seen a sea change when it comes to youth justice. And every time I share these numbers with people, I'm sort of astonished all over again. I just, you know, I just didn't think this would happen. So this is what I've spent the past 5 years investigating. How did this happen? What were the people and organizations and forces that made it happen? So I want to highlight just a couple of key elements that emerged from my reporting because I interviewed people all over the country who came at the problem from many different directions. But one strand that emerged from all of these interviews was the power of truth telling. And I know that that sounds really naive in this supposedly post-truth era that we're in. But if you think about it, if the truth were not a powerful lever for change, then those invested in maintaining the status quo wouldn't be putting so much time and energy into suppressing it. So truth telling is really, I think, the central theme of this movement for a couple of reasons. What I discovered was that before you can close a prison, you have to expose what's actually going on inside it. And before you can truly free a child in the deepest sense of that word, you have to make sure that child is seen in their full humanity. Because prisons, in order to function, depend on two parallel things, dehumanization and invisibility. I don't know, if folks have been inside or most of us have at least driven past one, and the gates and bars and walls and razor wire that ostensibly function to keep people inside them also keep the rest of us out. As a reporter, it's been very challenging for me to get inside these places. Give away a trade secret. Often I've had to express interest in reporting on some nice program like Girl Scouts Behind Bars or something, and then hope that once I'm in, they kind of forget about me, which probably shouldn't be saying in public.
We won't tell.
Okay. Uh, and even family members who face all kinds of obstacles to visiting their kids, even when they get inside, they're limited to tightly controlled visiting rooms. So what's actually happening on the units where young people are spending their days and spending their nights is largely hidden from view. So I think in that vein, I want to talk about one of the earliest groups of activists that I came across because their efforts to push back against an authoritarian system, even when they were in the grips of that system, I think, have a lot to tell us about the moment that we find ourselves in today. And these are young people who were being held on disciplinary lockdown units. So sort of the prison inside a prison in California Youth Authority institutions in the 1990s. And I learned of their efforts from an amazing civil rights attorney named Sue Burrell. And the great thing about Sue is that before she went to law school, she was a librarian. And as a result, she held on to everything and she shared her archives with me and gave me boxes and boxes full of letters that these young men had written. In what turned out to be an organized letter writing campaign, despite the fact that they were being held in virtual solitary confinement, despite the fact that they really barely had school, they didn't have family visits, they were very shut off from public view. But I won't go into how, but they had gotten hold of Sue's address and they organized a letter writing campaign. And a lot of what they described was familiar to me from the reporting for Burning Down the House. They talked about how if they committed an infraction or just irritated a guard, essentially a SWAT team in paramilitary guard would rush into their cells, strip them naked, handcuff them, or in some cases, hog tie them, and then beat and pepper spray them while they were helpless and restrained. And I knew about these practices from kids I knew from prior reporting, but there was something about seeing them in these shaky handwritten letters, shaky because the kids were writing with some like smuggled pencil stubs, or in one instance, just a shard of lead that a young man had gotten a hold of. Something about that just shocked me again. I keep thinking I can't be shocked, and then I am shocked. Uh, because they also described a practice I didn't know about, which is that uh, guards would duct tape to their cell so that there was no ventilation, and then throw a chemical grenade into the cell. And that was so kind of stunning to me that I decided I needed to dig a little deeper. And I found a newspaper article where the superintendent of one of the institutions told a reporter that she felt this practice was, her words, a creative solution to the problem of guards being forced to inhale toxic chemicals that were intended for children. Um, and when I say that these young people were activists, I'm not romanticizing them and I'm not being metaphorical. The letters, for example, one thing I found in Sue's archives was a manila envelope that was so overstuffed that it had split at the seams because, again, in these conditions of virtual solitary confinement, a young man had somehow gathered letters from a bunch of other people on his unit, gotten them to his mother, who then got them to Sue. And these letters, one kid had written down not just the name, but the serial number of the grenade that was thrown into his cell, so that as he wrote to Sue, they can't say I made it up. Another kid had enclosed several pages from the ward's rights handbook, and he had numbered his concerns to correspond with each provision that was being violated. Another kid had done the exact same thing with the United States Constitution. And what really stood out to me and really showed me that they were organizers was how frequently they used the pronoun we. Often a kid would describe not what had happened to him, but what he had seen happen to a kid the next cell over. And again, they used the pronoun we, like we need our rights respected. We need some outside help. So they not only understood the need to break through the silence, because nobody knew this was happening back then. The Youth Authority actually had a pretty good reputation to break through the silence, but they also understood that the best way to do that, the only way to do that, was collectively. So they really were organizers. And then there was Sue, who was an advocate who had not experienced youth incarceration herself or in her family life, but who, once she saw it, couldn't look away. So she was just relentless in ensuring that these young people got a hearing. She shared their letters with reporters, with other advocates, with public defenders, with legislators, trying to get relief for an individual kid, but also, as she told me, trying to build a record. And this is something I saw over and over across the country. The driving force of this movement, as with every civil rights movement in the history of, well, not just this country, but probably the world, the driving force was people who had experienced this, but they succeeded with the help of allies who were driven not by personal experience, but by a sense of justice. So while Sue was working with these young people to make sure that their voices were heard, other advocates were working with parents. And this, I write about this in both California and Louisiana, but it happened across the country. Mothers and fathers and grandparents, sometimes siblings who had lost a child to these institutions would come together and they'd write letters, they would testify at hearings, they held march after march and rally after rally. And most powerfully, every time a child died in one of these places, which is something that to this day happens with appalling frequency, they would hold candlelight vigils. You'd see them with one sign with a picture of their child's battered face and another sign with that child as a beaming toddler. So they were supporting each other, they were grieving together, but again, they were asserting their children's humanity in the face of a system that was determined to deny it. And then meanwhile, you had civil rights attorneys like Sue and many others who were filing conditions lawsuits across the country. Um, and ostensibly, conditions lawsuit aims at improving the conditions inside an institution. Maybe Patrick can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's no statute you can sue under to close a prison. But through these conditions lawsuits, again, they pierced that veil of invisibility because most of them ended in consent decrees. And most of those consent decrees required a court-appointed monitor to come in. In California, there were dozens of monitors, and these monitors not only had access to the institution, they had access to the children. So they were able to come out and share what was actually going on with the public, with reporters, with judges, which was especially important because most judges have never been inside the places they send children to. And an unfortunate number were, and I think still are, under the misapprehension that you send a kid to these systems to get services that they can't get at the county level. So once judges were forced to look at what was actually happening, they started sending fewer kids to state institutions. And that triggered a really important virtuous cycle because the fewer kids there are in these huge cavernous buildings, the higher the per capita cost gets. In some places like New York, that cost reached $1 million per kid. And once that happened, advocates could make a fiscal argument rather than just a moral one. And I think that was an easier one for politicians to accept and support. Um, so I think I'm going to stop here with the good news and just share a little bit of the new news, which is that despite this incredible progress, or I guess more likely because of it, we do find ourselves today at a moment of backlash, and one that unfortunately looks and sounds a lot like the super predator era, not in terms of the numbers of kids incarcerated, but in terms of the rhetoric. And it's easy to attribute that backlash to the current political climate, but it actually predates it. It started with the pandemic when kids didn't have school, they didn't have after school programs, they didn't have social supports, they didn't have recreation. And in that void, unsurprisingly, across the country, there were short-term localized upticks in youth crime, particularly the iconic crime of carjacking, which was, the key a key driver of the super predator rhetoric. So that started to happen, and I think two things happened as a result. People got scared, reasonably so, and then politicians and some parts of the media capitalized on that fear and continue to do so to this day, even though youth crime has now dropped again, not only to pre-pandemic levels, but to the lowest point in the history of maybe not this country, but the history of documenting youth crime. Because not only did youth incarceration drop by 75%, so did youth crime. So at the safest moment in our country's history, we find ourselves facing a new wave of fear mongering. Several states have now passed laws in the last couple of years that are trying to return us to the practice of trying kids as adults, adding new charges that kids can be transferred to adult court for, lowering the age. And, just a few weeks ago at the national level, before Congress went into recess, it passed a couple of laws, one of which lowers the age at which DC youth, because that's who Congress has jurisdiction over, can be tried as adults. Another undoes some progress around emerging adults. And here in California, where I live, and in other places, we have a new wave of district attorneys who ran successfully on reversing their predecessors' policies and returning to the practice of trying kids as adults. So if you look at the big picture, it's still pretty good, although the the 2023 numbers just came out a few weeks ago. And for the first time in 25 years, there has been an uptick in youth incarceration. It's tiny. It's about 4,000 more kids than in 2021. But if you look at a graph of youth incarceration from 2000 to 2021, what you see is a long, steady, unbroken decline, no zigs and zags. And we did have a little zig in 2023. So the big picture is immensely positive. The book is a very hopeful one. At the same time, there are some warning lights flashing right now that maybe we'll get a chance to talk about together. So I think I'm going to stop there. I'm really excited to hear what's going on in Evanston from Patrick, because honestly, what keeps me hopeful and energized is that the work is continuing.
I use his pronouns, and I'm the executive director of the James B. Moran Center, which is based right here in the state of Evanston. Now, believe it or not, actually, this is our second time meeting.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you should not be embarrassed whatsoever. It was 12 years ago.
Yeah, that's right.
You came to Evanston and you spoke at the Unitarian Church.
I did. Thank you so much for coming.
Yes, and I was there, and I actually brought several clients with me to your talk on burning down the house. And it was an incredible talk. And I remember it to this day. Actually, I even went back in my Manila folder and found pictures from that event, because it was
I'm really touched by that. I was just in touch with Gail Smith, who I think organized that.
She did. She absolutely did. She's still making good trouble. And then Sue Burrell actually is one of my sheroes too. So I'm a juvenile defense attorney, and Sue is kind of a powerhouse within the juvenile defense community. She's a civil rights attorney, but I think of her more so as a youth defender.
Absolutely. It's a small world, but I love that about this world.
Yes, this world is very small, particularly the juvenile defense community. So I'm an executive director of a legal aid agency, but I'm also a youth defense attorney too. So I can speak somewhat approximately to this incredibly broken system. But I wanted to start off today. Heather graciously allowed me to speak about the Moran Center as a whole, just to educate folks about local resources and local system support for youth and their families. So the Moran Center was founded nearly 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, in 1972. 2 years prior to that, the community experienced two really horrific youth tragedies. One was a child escaped actually from a youth detention facility, returned home to Evanston, and committed suicide. A second young person was accused of manslaughter involving his 2-year-old child. The young man's name is John Cox. His child's name was Sydney. John was detained by the Evanston Police Department for more than 72 hours, denied food, access to medical attention, even access to basic information about the status of his child, his 2-year-old. John was then transported not once, not twice, but 3 times in a coma because he attempted suicide in his jail cell at the Evanston Police Department. And on his 3rd transport to medical institutions, he passed away. At the time, Alderman James B. Moran and Alderman Brew Alexander were on the Evanston City Council, and both attorneys, both civil rights attorneys too, conducted a sweeping investigation. Police department, the hospitals, which included Evanston Hospital, Cook County Hospital, and then Cermak Hospital, which is our jail hospital. The courts, public defender's office, and ultimately concluded that one critical need that screamed out from these horrors in our community was that children and young adults needed community-based defenders wrapped with integrated social work spaces, which was a really revolutionary model in 1972. It's not as revolutionary today as it was 50 years ago. But that is the core of, that is the founding story of the Moran Center. There are two tie-ins then to President Carter in our story as an organization. First is President Carter in 1976 studied our model here in Evanston and brought it to the federal level. The U.S. Department of Justice invested in community defense organizations all across the country, including starting 5 here in Cook County. The Moran Center at the time was called the Evanston Community Defender Organization. We were part of that movement. And the impact of having defense services proximate to children and families that they were serving was really revolutionary. And I truly believe if Jimmy Carter had been reelected and there had been greater investment in that model, we would be having potentially a different conversation today. But as we all know, the story ends with the election of Ronald Reagan and the defunding of the community defense model. Before Jimmy Carter left office, he did something else that ties into the Moran Center story. He appointed James B. Moran to the federal bench. So James B. Moran ultimately was a judge, the presiding judge, in fact, of the Northern District of Illinois. And when he passed away in 2009, we renamed the organization in his honor, not just because he was a phenomenal jurist, but because he helped found our organization back in 1972. So that's the founding story of the Moran Center, how we got our start, who we are, who we're tied into, who we're connected with. I also think it's important just to tell you about our evolution. So the core of our work today continues to be representing children and emerging adults up to the age of 26 in the criminal legal system, both in the adult system and in the juvenile delinquency system. As we've evolved as an organization, we have seen how children, families are flushed out of the system and shackled with permanent records that preclude them from moving on with their lives. So we, as the defense organization, started in 2009 an expungement and sealing practice where we help people destroy their records or at least hide them as best as we can from the public so as people can get that job, get that mortgage, get that loan. Because I think we all know in this room that the record can hold back people from attaining all of those things. And really, arrests and adjudications in this country really serve as permanent bars to success. And that is deliberate. We as attorneys have done what we can to try to relieve that mark that our community places, our society places on people who have been trapped in the criminal legal system. We've also, as attorneys and social workers, thought about how do we keep people out of this broken system? And we have found ourselves in the economic business and also in the educational business. You often hear the phrase school to prison pipeline. It is real. It is real in our community. It is real in the country that we fail children educationally. Children then don't want to go to school, often then don't go to school, and then get caught in the criminal legal system for myriads of reasons. And we truly believe that if we help support children succeed in school, we can help stem the school to prison pipeline. So in 2010, the Moran Center started an education advocacy program. And we started the program representing children that we were representing in juvenile court and educational proceedings. So children that were being expelled from school, suspended from school, but also were being failed by our educational system. That were juniors and seniors in high school, but had been passed along from grade to grade to grade and were still reading at a first grade level. We started representing those kids and getting them the services and supports they needed to hopefully be successful in school. As that program evolved, now I reflect on it, very unsurprising. Guardians would call us back and say, thanks for helping my grandson. I'm also caring for this younger grandchild who's 5. I think he might be on the autism spectrum. And everyone at school is telling me I'm crazy. Can you help with him? And it's like, oh, that wasn't our intent to help a 5-year-old, but yeah, why not? Right? Because if we can help that 5-year-old be diagnosed, be evaluated, get the supports and services that child needs at 5, the hope would be then they would never need our services later on in that child's progression and development. So our education advocacy program now serves children as young as 3 and as old as 22. 22 is when you age out of America's public education system. On the economic side, we often refer at the Moran Center to the poverty to institutionalization pipeline. There are so many ways our country has perfected the institutionalization of people that we otherize, people who are experiencing poverty, people experiencing homelessness, disabled people, etc. And we as lawyers in our community have made a commitment to supporting families that are being evicted, imposed upon, denied public benefits, really anything that destabilizes the family and thus the child in that home, with the goal of keeping kids in our schools and in our community. We also just recently, and it is total coincidence, launched an immigration practice at Moran Center. I am obviously incredibly grateful that we have an immigration attorney on staff, as our community is under assault by the Trump administration, by ICE enforcement, by DHS. We now have an immigration practice that is attempting to represent those children and families that are being caught in this depraved enforcement environment we find ourselves in. The last piece of the Moran Center, so I talked about our core legal services, how we as an organization have evolved to address a myriad of pipelines that either draw people into the system or flush them out inappropriately without supports and a second chance. We then wrap all of our children and families in integrated social work services. That's both therapy and case management. But then the last piece of wrapping paper that's wrapped around all of our services is restorative justice. So we are a restorative organization. I love that we're sitting in the circle. I am a circle keeper. We train folks to be circle keepers. And if you've never heard of the phrase restorative justice, in a nutshell, it is belief that we should be radically engaged with each other and that no one should be defined by their worst mistake. Those are the key principles of restorative justice. And we do a lot of training in our community to educate people about restorative justice, to help them be circle keepers in their own neighborhoods, synagogues, churches, neighborhoods. We are in our schools, yes, the very schools that we often sue. So we are walking some fine lines. But we really do believe that by educating kindergartners and second graders and fifth graders and teachers and administrators in restorative justice, we can drive ourselves out of business. And that should be the eventual goal of every nonprofit. If you start to solve a problem and the problem is still persisting, it means you're not winning. And so this is our vision of building a restorative community, which is our get out of business. I don't envision us going out of business anytime soon, given the dark ages and dystopia we are living in, but I am going to adopt Nell's word of hope. I am a hopeful guy. And I really do think that restorative justice at its core is about hope and maintain. So that is who the Moran Center is, and I'm really honored to be in dialogue with you, Nell, and to answer any questions that you have, Heather, or that you all have for us. Thank you.
Andrea, I know you've got some questions. Can I just quickly, Patrick, respond to what you said?
Of course.
I just loved hearing it. In the last couple of chapters, I look at, if not prisons, what, right? Like what actually advances public safety. And I feel like I got that wrong in burning down the house because all the research I read, every young person I talked to told me the same thing, which is they need everything. Like, I want more for my children than just not to be incarcerated. And it sounds like you want more for the young people that you work with than just not to be incarcerated. So I just love that you're working to provide that 5-year-old with what they need. Not like, I don't think kids want to be seen as an object of prevention, but they do need to be invested in. And you probably know of a woman named Candace Jones who ran so I have a chapter on her. Um, she ran the Illinois youth justice system for a few years with the express intent of running it into the ground. And I remember her saying to me, we know exactly what public safety looks like. It looks like Evanston. It looks like Hyde Park, meaning it looks like a community, a resourced community where young people get what they need, not a highly policed community where young people are stopped every time they walk down the block. So I just want to express my appreciation for the fact that you have brought your work beyond keeping kids out of institutions and really tackled the question of what keeps us safe.
Great, and it also speaks to the really deep root cause analysis that has taken place. It's not Band-Aid, it's like really how far upstream can we get? And yeah, 3 years old, that's pretty far upstream. Like, I'm glad you're doing that. Okay, so I have some questions. Does anybody else have any questions for Nell or for Patrick? If you do, you can either write them down on a card and I can read them for you if you're feeling shy, or you can just raise your hand and I'll pass you the mic so that Nell can hear you as well. So I'll start us off. My question for you now, just to get started, is can you tell us about the practice of trying children and sentencing children as adults, and in what ways that practice has been changed by neurodevelopmental research, and also what ways it has not been changed by that research?
Yeah, I'm glad you phrased the question that way, because all of what I talk about is a both and. We've made progress and we're still doing this. Trying a child as an adult is kind of magical thinking. It's as if you tried to purchase an apple as an orange. Like, it just doesn't make sense that a judge can bring his gavel down and this kid's a child and this kid is an adult. And it's a practice that just kind of really took off in the super predator years, because what that super predator story did was dehumanize Black and brown youth to the degree that we allowed ourselves to believe that some children just weren't children at all. And once we let ourselves believe that, well, let's take them out of the juvenile court. Let's just write that dehumanization, that adultification into law. So in the years, from the late 90s on, almost every state in the country passed a law facilitating this transmogrification of children into adults solely for the purposes of punishment. As this movement advanced, as youth prisons began to close down, there was a lot of concern among advocates that judges, if they didn't have that option of sending kids to a big bad state-run youth prison, would transfer more kids to adult court. That didn't happen. I think I mentioned this at the beginning. We now have 80% fewer kids transferred to adult court than we did at the turn of the millennium. So that's also a success story that I think people don't know about. And you mentioned neuroscience. So one of the main drivers of this change was work by developmental psychologists and neuroscientists who, first they did a series of tests to look at young people's cognition. And one of this is also kind of local, Lori Garducci at the MacArthur Foundation, which supported this work more than anyone else, told me about an experiment where they took teenagers and gave them a computer game of chicken, essentially. They had to drive a digital car as close to a digital wall as they could without hitting it. And if you gave a kid that challenge on their own, they'd stop a few inches from the wall. If you put them in a group, they all crashed into the wall. So that tells us something about how the adolescent's brain is influenced by the peer group. And then a device was invented called the fMRI, functional magnetic help me out here, resonance imaging, which not only allowed scientists to look at the adolescent brain, it allowed it to look at it in motion. So they would do different tests and see which parts of the brain lit up. And again, they found hard evidence that young people are prone to risk taking, not aware of future consequences. So deterrence just doesn't work with them. And that risk taking is developmentally positive. That's how they explore the world. That's how they find out who they are. But obviously, to anyone who's ever raised a teenager or been a teenager or known a teenager, it sometimes goes south. There's research I cite in Burning Down the House that when you do confidential interviews, more than 90% of adults acknowledge having done something as a teenager that could have gotten them arrested. And the majority have done something that could have led to their incarceration. But for white kids with resources, they go through this magical process of rehabilitation known as growing up. If you just leave them alone, if you let their families and their communities figure out what to do, by 25, they're just not doing the crazy stuff anymore. Black and brown kids don't have that privilege of growing out of the developmentally dangerous years. But I'm going a little off track here, but what happened was that neuroscience and developmental research made its way to the Supreme Court in a series of decisions known as the Miller Trilogy. So first, the Supreme Court decided that because of the malleability of the adolescent brain, it wasn't okay to execute a child. And then they later decided it wasn't okay to subject a child to mandatory life without parole. You can still sentence a kid to life without parole. You just have to look at their individual circumstances. And then the third decision made that retroactive. And I have a story up on the imprintnews.org, about an incredible gathering that took place a couple days ago in Philadelphia of men, I think they're all men, who were sentenced to life without parole as teenagers and were later released because of these Supreme Court decisions, and are now doing incredible work in their communities as credible messengers and mentors and advocates, and just kind of like raising families, starting businesses. They grew out of it. So I think the scariest thing happening right now is this desire to return to trying kids as adults. The numbers still look good, but I think the real danger is that we do go back to that, knowing what we know now, knowing that it makes no sense developmentally, no sense scientifically. There is still a push to go back to that very punitive, counterproductive measure.
Thank you. That was really helpful. I want to also ask Patrick a question about a similar question about the neurodevelopmental research and its influences on your practices at Moran. So this shift to include people in their early and mid-20s in the category of youth, do you see this research impacting the courts, such as offering services instead of sentencing to people as old as 24 and 25 years old?
Yes. In short. So first, I would like to speak to it as impacting Moran Center. So the Moran Center for 40 years represented emerging adults up to the age of 22. And if you want my theory as to why 22, I think it was because Judge Moran at the time had a 21-year-old child who he knew was still a child, and said, this is still a child. We should represent kids up to the age of 22. That's my theory. I don't know if that's true. And he is now passed away, so I can't ask. But I still think it was brilliant and innovative at the time. But he was only applying what every parent already knew and has always known, that my 21-year-old is not a fully formed adult. That's why parents in Winnetka, when they go to neighborhood parties, refer to their babies at Cornell, right? They are still their children, and often refer to them as such. But the Moran Center only revisited the age of 22 about 10 years ago now. because of the burgeoning brain science that says that the distinction between a 22, 23-year-old and an 18-year-old or 17-year-old is not. And that reaches up to, particularly for males, up to the age of 26. And so we said to comport with burgeoning neurodevelopmental science, we raised our age representation from 22 to 26. So I think we as a defense bar had to first recognize, had to shift our own thinking. And then you're bringing me into how are we as defenders educating the courts, bringing the courts along to also apply the brain science, which is now pointed out is cited in Graham and Miller and other U.S. Supreme Court cases that now we as defenders can cite to. We have seen progress in Illinois and Cook County. For example, under Chief Judge Timothy Evans, who only has 1 week left in his job as Chief Judge. Chief Judge Evans started in 2015 restorative justice community groups. And it started as one in Lawndale. There are now 5. There's one in Austin, Englewood, North Lawndale, Avondale, and Sauk Village. And these courts are designed to serve young people up to the age of 26. And if they complete this essentially deferred prosecution program, their case will be dismissed. Now, we as a defense bar, I think, hope that those courts have greater jurisdiction over time, that more and more cases are referred to those courts. Primarily, they're being used as diversions for nonviolent drug offenses, essentially. We at Moran Center firmly believe that more serious cases could be resolved in that forum. But I think that's one example of the courts recognizing that children, young adults under the age of 26 are different than their older adult counterparts. So those are 2 examples of, I think, how neuroscience is impacting both the practice of law, but then also how the courts are thinking about young people.
That's really awesome that they have those 5 restorative justice programs in the courts. I didn't know about that. I'm really excited to hear that. And yeah, I hope it also starts to include more serious offenses. Before I worked in the adult department, I worked in the teen on the 3rd floor. So we had to do some specific training on teenagers, the teenage brain, and the way that they put it sort of in a nutshell was that teenagers have an accelerator pedal. They don't have a brake pedal. So they can hit the gas, they can't hit the brake. So it's just sort of an easy image to refer to whenever you're dealing with a teenager that's acting crazy. Like they just don't have their brake pedal yet, until they're 25, that frontal lobe just hasn't finished cooking.
I gotta ask, Patrick, did you say for boys they're now saying it's 26?
Yes.
26.
Yes.
I have 24-year-old boy-girl twins, so I'm fascinated by that.
They are a control study in and of themselves.
Yes, I've always said that, but 26.
Another thing I'll just quickly say, just to drive home a point Nell made about who we call a criminal, right? We call people criminals when they're caught, or maybe even worse, when they're arrested.
That's right.
And we're ready for the holidays, and you actually helped me start thinking about this, Heather, in preparation for today. We're all getting ready for the holidays. One of the most powerful, I'll call it an art medium, that has helped me explain to other people Nell's really poignant point was a piece done by PRX many years ago, and it's easily Googleable because I just tested it out, it still works, and it's called Who's a Criminal? And it interviews tons of people about all the crazy stuff they did when they were teenagers. And none of them are criminals because none of them were caught. It's a great little fun piece to share with your Trump aunt or cousin and play it. There's a really funny tidbit about a woman stealing a fire hydrant. And how does one steal a fire hydrant? I have no idea, but it is so funny.
Oh my God, my father in like the 1920s stole a newspaper box. He did get arrested, but they let him right away.
It's a great piece. So just to drive home Nell's point, I think keep that in your back pocket. Who's a criminal? PRS.
Can I just add to that also influences crime. We don't have statistics when we have the National Victimization Study, but crime statistics are usually arrest statistics and prosecution statistics. So those are also skewed by the racial targeting that goes on in policing and prosecution. So when you look at things like crime is up, crime is down, remember that means arrests are up, arrests are down.
That's a really important distinction to make. Does anybody have questions? We have a question.
I don't, oh,
Just so that Nell can hear you,
Excuse me.
now the incarceration of juveniles that you described is just horrific. It's immoral, it's brutality, and you've done a great job restricting the incarceration in those type of facilities. You should be blessed for that.
Thank you.
But I need to give just a little bit of a story. Maybe it's a bit of a reality check. In 1972, when you opened up, or when the Moran Center under another name was opened up, I started as an assistant state's attorney in juvenile court, which was a wonderful experience for the guy who was living in Winnetka, went to Faith Open Charity, went to Loyola Academy, went to Notre Dame, went to Loyola Law School, never had a real black friend and probably until college. So I'm now in the heart of juvenile crime in Cook County on Roosevelt Road. And I think I was maybe a progressive prosecutor before it became the in thing to do. I was constantly aware of the fact, and I know this is a great generalization, that these kids I saw in court and were prosecuted never had a friggin' chance. Never had a chance. Did some, yes. But the ones from the west side of Chicago and various neighborhoods you mentioned were sort of court. I was of the opinion these poor kids don't have a chance. But, you know, we'll give them the break that we can give them and prosecute them where we were supposed to prosecute them. And in 72, Cook County, or the state of Illinois, had the transfer. I forget the section, I think it was 11402 or something like that, transferring juvenile to adult. My boss was a social worker before he became a lawyer, before he became a prosecutor. He taught us that we do not make that petition unless you've been through the juvenile system before and it didn't work. No matter what the crime, he could take the heat. So when I read recently that more states are going back to that system, I was kind of shocked, and I know full well that they don't use the same standards that Maury Dore used in 1972. I stayed in the prosecutor's office and prosecuted adults until 1981, and then went into private practice. I had the same feeling when I was prosecuting adults that I had in juvenile court. When you look at the background of the defendants, not all of them, but their parents are pretty much non-existent. There might be a grandmother involved. They have no real adult supervision throughout their life. They have a juvenile record. Now they're 20 or 18 and they committed armed robbery. And I look at that and I know he has to be punished because the law says that if you commit an armed robbery, you are subject to a minimum of 6 years to 30 years in prison. So, but you look at it and you go, you never, and you don't tell them that, you never had a chance. You never had a chance with your background. And that's the real problem. It all goes back to that. When we talk about crime and punishment, it goes to me. If I were 18 and going to Loyola Academy and I put a gun to some woman's head and took her purse, I should go away. I had all the benefits. But these other folks, the vast majority of them in the system, when you reflect on their childhood, they just never had a chance. Your program is phenomenal, but unfortunately it's only limited to the people that are on your list that you can help. It doesn't apply to Jackson, Mississippi. So all this other stuff that's going around, and it just looks to me like Nell and you, Pat, you're swimming upstream all the time, every single moment. And you do great work. I mean, the people you touch are helped, which is great. But universally speaking, it's not happening. And it's always been, I mean, I do this in my office when I'm interviewing clients. I don't say it to them, but you never had a chance. You were young, you were on the street, you didn't have a mother, you don't know who your father is, there's drugs involved, there wasn't a book in your house to read, as if somebody wanted to read. And that's where I get just lost that this is, I guess I'm looking for encouragement.
No, you're absolutely right. And swimming upstream, look, okay, let's pretend for a minute that what we really cared about was public safety, that we didn't want people to be robbed at gunpoint. We would have to make sure that every kid got a chance. And is that a heavy lift? Yeah, because that would require the redistribution of resources, which is the exact opposite of what's happening in this country. But I also want to say, I'm really glad that you raised the points that you did, because we can't talk about youth justice or criminal justice without talking about victimization. I have been the victim of juvenile crime. I had a kid put a gun to my head and he was drunk and I was terrified. I don't know how deep I want to get into this, but he had been charged as an adult when he was a teenager and been sent to San Quentin here in California. This happened after he got out. I watched him walk away after he did that. He threw his gun into my garbage can, walked away drunk and furious. And I thought, if I call the police, which I wanted to do because I was terrified, this kid's going to go away for 30 years because he had 2 strikes under California state law. So I, as a victim of crime, was left with either way too harsh a punishment or nothing. This young man is now working, raising a family, contributing to the community. And just in the last couple, I think what I'm going to do is just offer a tiny challenge to the idea that there are people who face odds that are unbelievable. But I think everyone does have a chance. And I've spent the last couple of weeks interviewing men who served juvenile life without parole sentences. So these guys did horrific things. I mean, you don't go away for life if there's not a body. So these are people who killed people, often in really brutal ways, and then were incarcerated and still somehow turned their lives around and are now actively sowing safety in the community. So I'm not saying that happens every time. I couldn't agree with you more that the odds are just profoundly stacked against some kids. Just we got to do something about those odds. And yeah, Patrick's organization can't serve everyone, but I hate to say there's 1,000 points of light, but there are a lot of organizations out there doing this work. Another really troubling thing that's happened is that the federal government has defunded all kinds of community-based violence interventions and gang prevention initiatives that worked successfully with kids who didn't seem to have much of a chance. So that's in our hands too, right? Whether people have a chance or not. At the same time, I can't imagine what you have seen as a prosecutor, the limited options available to you, and yeah, we gotta think about that.
And I have one question. Are you heard well in all states or just certain states?
I didn't catch the whole question.
Are the red states old timers lock the kid up or?
So it's interesting. Yes and no. One state that I look at really closely is Louisiana, where, that's a red state, right? Uh, and it's contradictory. The mothers of Louisiana fought and are still fighting an incredible fight. They closed the worst of that state's youth prisons and got a law passed that was meant to transform Louisiana's youth justice system into one like Missouri's, which has smaller therapeutic facilities. Youth incarceration in Louisiana, on the one hand, dropped by close to 80%. On the other hand, in 2022, the state of Louisiana took a group of almost entirely Black children out of juvenile detention facilities, put them on a bus, and sent them to an abandoned death row at Angola State Penitentiary, which is a former slave plantation where incarcerated men still work the fields under the watch of mounted guards. On the other hand, Louisiana, even more recently, had an amendment to the Constitution, to the state constitution on its ballot, Amendment 4, that would have allowed for a lot more kids to be tried as adults. And there was an incredible press by advocates, and the Louisiana voters voted that down. So it's not exactly red blue. I mean, it's complicated. But this, we wouldn't have a 75% drop in youth incarceration nationwide if it were only blue states. Yes, at the moment, quote unquote, red states are more punitive, but there's also an infrastructure, a movement infrastructure that has been built up over the years. So I don't see them going all the way backwards.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate the question. It's a really good question.
I'd love a chance to just briefly respond to it too, particularly the blue versus red. So Illinois, last month, what month was this? Yeah, last month, raised the age of pretrial detention in our state. And I'm trying to artfully provide the answer because I don't want to ruin my punchline. But Illinois, a deeply blue state, raised the age of detention for pretrial detention for children. This was a legislative battle for the past decade, with supermajorities in both the House and the Senate of Democrats. Supermajorities. This bill also was highly negotiated. So it is not a perfect proposal that's sitting on Governor Pritzker's desk right now. We are only raising the age on a phased-in scale from 10 to 13.
Oh my gosh.
Say it again.
Prior to this proposal being likely enacted by Governor Pritzker, the state of Illinois, this can also be a topic for Thanksgiving dinner. Our state allowed the detention of children at the age of 10 pre-trial. It took us 10 years and lots of negotiation to raise the age to just 13. And it's going to be phased in for the next 2 years. Okay? It's crazy. It's crazy. The state of Illinois, again, a deeply blue state, still has no minimum age of prosecution. None. Common law, which we learned at Loyola Law School, says culpability starts at the age of 8. So in theory, under common law, we prosecute 8 9-year-olds in our state because we do not have a minimum age of prosecution. So we are a deeply blue state, and we have made incredible strides like raising the age of the juvenile court from 16 to 17 to 18. We have raised the age for automatic transfer of children to the adult system. We have restrained the number of offenses that trigger the automatic transfer statute. But even blue states, like our great state of Illinois, still has a long, long way to go. And the last thing I'll say, just as a guy who's been representing kids who, I agree with you, most of whom have not been given a first chance, let alone a second chance. What I love about representing kids and emerging adults, because I do both, is I've never met a kid who didn't want to do well.
Mhm.
I've never met a kid who didn't want to make me proud. I'm just a lawyer. Who didn't want me to love. And again, I'm just a, like, I don't want us to ever have a conversation that otherizes kids that are in our criminal legal system, because they're just kids who are the same as all children. They all want to do well. They all want to be loved. They all want to make us proud. And that's been universal. Like, there are very few things that I say everybody or all is all in my experience. So I just wanted to say that too.
I appreciate that. And it is mind-boggling and enraging. And I don't understand what planet people are from when they think they 10 and 13, like, okay. So this actually brings me to a question I was going to save for later, but I want to ask it now, based on what we were just hearing about. So in your Belly of the Beast chapter, you described the Coalition for Juvenile Justice Annual Summit as an exercise in cognitive dissonance. And indeed, the chair of the Emerging Leaders Committee came to the conclusion that the system is, quote, still going to always hurt, it's still going to always cage, and it's still always going to kill my brothers and sisters. And he suggested abolishment. The call for abolition seems to always only ever be met by policymakers, by mainstream culture, with calls for reform. And reform is kind of an example of reform, is what Patrick just mentioned, by increasing the age from 10 to 13, which is still like absurd. So now, in your observation, how do the activists who are personally impacted by the carceral system, how do they navigate that tension between calling for abolition and being met with a call for reform?
So it's interesting. I think we usually talk about reform and abolition as if they were somehow pitted against one another. They go hand in hand. And this particular young man was an incarcerated advocate who pushed very hard for reform. I think his initial campaign was to get more items available in the commissary. And, you know, I used to say, I've never met someone who's been incarcerated as a kid or an adult who was a pure abolitionist, because they know that guy. Like, they have met the 0.005% of the incarcerated population who are perhaps sociopathic, and are going to do real harm in ways that, you know, most of us have been lucky enough not to meet that guy. I was talking with a friend, really wise friend, whose father spent his life in prison the other day, about how to talk about this question of what do we do when a kid has committed serious harm. And what she said, I just thought it was so important. She said, yeah, there are times when a kid needs to be sat down for a minute. There are times when a kid needs to be removed. There are never a time when a kid needs to be isolated. So I'm not saying there are never times when a child poses such a danger that we don't need to remove them to interrupt whatever is making them so dangerous and protect the community. The problem is that we do it in a way that is criminogenic. Being incarcerated as a juvenile significantly increases the odds that you'll go on to commit further crimes as an adult. It doubles the chance of a premature death. So reform, yeah, we need to make these places that don't churn out adult criminals, which is what we've got now. We need to make them better. And that will create a positive cycle. If we can create places that are not traumatizing, not stigmatizing, give young people who are in trouble what they need, then we're going to have less crime. And then we get a positive cycle. What we have right now is a vicious cycle where youth incarceration leads to crime, leads to incarceration. So I absolutely think we need reform at the same time as we shrink these systems, because kids live in these places. They only get one childhood. we don't have the luxury of saying, I'm an abolitionist, so I'm not going to try to make these places less horrific. Let's just let them be really, really terrible so that eventually we tear them down. I think that is a place where I'm very firmly in the both and camp.
I love that framing. That's really good. Yeah, it's both and. Because otherwise you're abandoning the people who are already in the system, right?
And, honestly, I think this whole conversation needs to center victims of crime. I mean, I do think when I think about the worst crimes that I've heard about, encountered, experienced, that if we really cared about public safety, and this is so obvious, we'd take guns off the street, not kids off the street. Our commitment to ensuring that every American is armed creates that never had a chance syndrome that the gentleman was speaking of. It tells me that we're profoundly unserious about public safety, but that is a subject for another day.
Well, I think that's central to the restorative justice that Patrick was talking about. I mean, that is my understanding of it. It has to do with restoring what was harmed by the crime, the act, whatever it was. So regarding restorative justice, I'm going to ask one more and then I'm going to open it back up again. I'm sorry, I'm being greedy. So it seems to me that Moran has provided society with a well-tested roadmap for building restorative justice. And it sounds like you have been involved in some conversations and some battles to get 3 years, additional years of childhood for people. But I was going to ask you, do you see a future for Moran-inspired state policy? Like, how is Moran working with Illinois electeds on legislation to protect youth under 26, not just under 13, but under 26, from the cruel and unusual punishment that is incarceration when your frontal lobe hasn't even finished developing?
Yeah. I do want to answer that question. And just want to build on the last thing that Nell said. There is a tension in the restorative justice community about restorative justice at its core centering victims. There's a part of our national, international practice that focuses on centering victims and restorative practices.
Mm-hmm.
I am more so in the camp though that centers community
Mm-hmm.
in restorative practices. And just to prove that out slightly, we just surveyed, we sat in circle with over 400 Evanston residents, and we surveyed a whole slew more, just asking them how they define safety, how they define community. And you know what? Nobody said the courts.
Yeah.
Nobody said a prison. Very few people said police, though some did. Some did. But most people said my neighbor.
That's right.
Right? My aunt. My teacher, because we talked to a lot of little kids too. My mom. Right? Like, that's safe. That's and then when you ask, like, okay, if somebody does something to you, harms you in something, what do you mean? And the things that people said is conversation, accountability. No one said exclusion. And I loved what you said now. Like, yeah, sometimes people need to be sat down, but that doesn't necessarily mean they need to be isolated. I wrote that down. I'm going to remember that the rest of my life.
I'm quoting Imani Davis.
Well, tell her that I'm quoting her the rest of my life, and I probably am going to stop attributing it to her at some point, just take full credit for it. But that's a great line, and so your question about what is the Moran Center doing, and Nell also pressed me on this too. Like, what are we doing to bring our practices elsewhere, our model elsewhere, and our thinking into policy? So a couple examples. Our practice model has actually been studied statewide, nationally, and internationally. And so we have seen our practice kind of bubble up in different areas, regionally, nationally, and internationally. I'm really proud of that. Secondly, related to that, the Cook County Public Defender's Office that we have an incredible partnership with just opened a community-based defense pilot program in Roseland, modeled on the Moran Center. It's this idea that public defense can be proximate to those we serve, and we can integrate civil services, social services, etc. So Roseland is going to be the next pilot of the Moran Center in partnership with the Cook County Public Defender's Office. Really excited about that work. And then in terms of policy, couple things. We a few years ago championed a bill, now law, in Springfield that provides a privilege to those that enter into restorative practices, modeled off of mediation. So I think we can all kind of picture what mediation is in our minds. And those who engage in mediation practices in the state of Illinois, and this is actually true across the country because of the Uniform Mediation Act, we have a privilege with each other when we sit in mediation. What is said in mediation cannot be used later on in a lawsuit or in front of a tribunal administrative hearing. We did not have that protection in restorative practices. So we now in the state of Illinois have a privilege when you enter into a circle practice with me. When I admit to causing harm, it can then not be used against me in a criminal proceeding. And that law is now being modeled in Oregon, Virginia, Maine, who else is contacted? New York. These other jurisdictions are taking what we did here first in Illinois and applying it elsewhere. And then what we need to do, and I hope to tackle this in the years ahead, is Chief Judge Evans started these restorative justice community courts, which is great, but they're just here in Cook County. And the state's attorney gets to decide what cases go to those courts. And I think it's really important for us to codify in state statute this model and to give power not just to the state's attorneys as to how cases are referred to these courts, but also to the community, to defense counsel, to the court, because I think these courts can really be transformational. They are reform, not abolition. It's both and, as Nell, I think, brilliantly said too. But those are just a few policy endeavors that we're engaged in now and how our model is slowly catching on. Not in Jackson, Mississippi yet, but we're getting there.
Yeah, that's really
Is there a moment for me to just respond to what Patrick said? I didn't know that there was this debate in the restorative justice community, but it's so interesting to me because I've been in these juvenile lifers, right, who, you know, their victim is dead. There's no reconciliation there. Sometimes I was talking to a man named Gani Sonster, who's an amazing restorative and transformative justice practitioner who killed someone as a kid and was released after many years under these second look laws. He and the family of the kid he killed would like to be in circle together. They can't be because of the terms of his probation. But what he said, which is ridiculous, but what he said is that what he did created a tear in the fabric of life. And so now his responsibility is he can't repair the harm he did. It's irreparable, but he can try to mend that tear in the fabric of life. And that really sounds like what you're talking about when you talk about a community focus. And it was helpful for me to hear it framed that way.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have a question that they'd like to ask? Or, okay, is this addressed to both or Nell or Pat?
Somewhat. First, I just want to really express my appreciation for all the work that you have done and continue to do, but also for speaking with us. I have kind of two questions. One is, like, what is the state of youth incarceration, at least what you can speak to today, like the conditions that people are in? And secondly, if you could speak to the role of like for-profit prisons and how that factors into all this.
I'll have to let Nell speak to the for-profit prison industrial complex because we don't have a private prison system in the state of Illinois, gratefully, so I can't speak to that. So I'll have to ask Nell to speak to that. But in terms of the state of affairs here in Illinois, I just want to be clear, there are really two types of carceral systems, right? In any community, there's pretrial detention, and then there's prison, right? Which is post-trial, post-adjudication, post-plea. And in Cook County, we have the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center. And then in the state of Illinois, we have something called the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice, which is our youth prison. Our Juvenile Temporary Detention Center has the lowest population it has had really in its history today, which is great. And it follows a trajectory of many reforms of many different types of institutions in our country. When we reduce the number of impacted people, we see a higher concentration of racial disparities. So we now see a higher percentage of Black and brown children in the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center than we've ever seen in its history. So the numbers are low, but our children are Black and brown at disproportionate rates. So that is just something that needs to be said and recognized. Our JDDC has been under watch for decades, and we have made certain strides. But just in 2023, Equip for Equality, which is an incredible organization in the state of Illinois with sweeping power because it is a quasi-federal agency, went into the jail, the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center, and really brought to light excessive confinement of children. We're talking about 23 hours a day. Talking about schooling that wasn't appropriate for children, children's individual education programs were not being followed, their IEPs were not being followed. I mean, really horrific conditions still at play in 2023. Our superintendent of the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center just resigned following years of critique of his leadership. People have asked me, am I hopeful now that he's resigned? No, I'm not, because he's just one guy. We just last week in Cook County, this past week in Cook County had an acquittal of a Juvenile Temporary Detention Center staff member who, I'm a defense attorney. I looked at the video. I mean, he abused this child, who was then lifeless, essentially, in his jail cell. Was acquitted of his crime. In minutes, the acquittal took minutes for the bench trial judge to acquit this man. And so, and that case stems from 2022, I believe. So we still have horrible conditions at our Juvenile Temporary Detention Center. And Cook County is not even the worst of the worst. ACLU of Illinois just sued Franklin County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center and was successful in closing it because children weren't given access to medical care, mental health care, 23 hours per day of excessive isolation, no schooling, like none. They received no school. So the state of pretrial detention here in Cook County and statewide for children is still horrid. In terms of our youth prison system, Nell spoke about Candace Jones. Governor Pritzker also has his eye on reforming our prison system for children. But there is a campaign in Illinois called the Final Five. There are 5 prisons left in our state, and those of us who really believe that these facilities are not serving our children well believe that they should be shuttered. With that said, though, the governor has a transformation plan. It's called the 21st Century Transformation Plan, and it is there's a program being started in Illinois called the Monarch Program, which is community-based, trauma-informed, smaller scale, very much modeled on California's system.
Oh no, we should talk.
Okay. Well, I think that there's some learnings from that, and the governor is using some of those learnings to launch this program called the Monarch Program. I think that the tension we feel as advocates is, yes, smaller is likely better. Community based is likely better than far-flung institutions where families are hundreds of miles away from their children. And are we just replicating the same system and checking a box? I'm somewhere in the middle. I'm feeling the tension, and I feel that tension. I think that Nell beautifully spoke to that. I want to address the system now as it is for the kids that are in the system now, and I hope that what we are doing now doesn't perpetuate the harms that we've caused for decades within the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice. So that's just a quick. That was not quick at all, but the quasi-quick answer to the state of affairs in Illinois and detention systems.
Thank you.
Did you want me to tackle the private prison thing, or?
You tackle whatever you want, Nell Bernstein.
Okay. All right. Okay. First off, if you're concerned about private prisons, I would say look at ICE, look at immigration detention, because that is where the money is right now. It's not a big issue at the youth prison level, but I would also say that all prisons are private prisons, and here's why. Whether they're run by a private corporation or the government, they are profit centers. I would steer you to a horrific article in the New Yorker a few months ago, I think, looking at state-run prisons where healthcare had been contracted out to a private corporation, and essentially people with psychiatric issues were starving to death. But it's interesting because the chapter in Our Future We Are Free that looks at Illinois looks at the economics of a prison town through Candace Jones's experience of trying to close IYC Kiwani. Her argument was that most of the kids who were incarcerated were from Chicago. They shouldn't be sent to a mostly white rural area that the parents couldn't get to without great difficulty, where horrific abuses were documented by the DOJ and et cetera. So she told me about going to a town hall in Kiwani, which, as she pointed out, under Illinois law, when you close a prison, you have to have a hearing. You don't have it in the area where the incarcerated people come from. You don't have it at the Capitol. You have it in the town where that prison is, because they are losing an economic engine. So I dug deep into that. I found the public comment. The whole town was at that hearing, and the whole town had submitted written testimony saying that basically it would be an economic train wreck if the prison were closed. The guy who ran the local muffler shop wrote that he was going to go out of business if he didn't have the opportunity to fix the cars of parents who had to drive so far to see their kids, as an argument for keeping this place open. At the hearing, I mean, there were billboards when Candace drove out there along the highway that said "Save IYC Kiwani," as if it were sort of a beloved family member or something. And many people from many kinds of business in the town testified, but the one that really struck her and struck me was the school superintendent, who got up and solemnly talked about child development and explained that if they were to close this institution, children would be torn from their schools and their communities and everything that they knew, because their parents would have to move to a new town for another prison job. Just completely erasing the Black and brown children who were torn from their homes, families, schools, and communities to keep this economic engine going and support this prison town. So whether a prison is privately run or publicly run, there's a huge financial incentive to keep them open.
There's an advocate in Illinois. Her name is Betsy Clark. She's actually Evanstonian. Who's the executive director of the Juvenile Justice Initiative, and she always uses the phrase in Illinois, "Build it and they will come."
That's right.
Yeah. If Payne County is building a youth detention center, it's because it's some type of economic engine.
No, and the kids know it. The number of kids who've said to me they have a bed waiting for me, I can't count.
Yeah.
Also, there were two Pennsylvania judges.
Oh God.
Who were.
Hold on. We gotta give him the mic.
No, can't you know?
Can you hear him now?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Oh.
And unfortunately know what you're about to say.
I'm a loud talker. there are two Pennsylvania judges who would sentence kids to a for-profit institution and take money as a bounty on their heads. And kickback for every kid that got sent there. I have seen every crime in the world.
Yep.
And I've been with every type of criminal. And that one absolutely just busted my head off. And some asshole judge would take $1,500 and send a 14-year-old to prison. It's
No, you're right.
amazing. Yeah.
And you know what? He did go to prison. So
Yes.
and it's interesting as someone who doesn't think prison is a great idea, how kind of vindicating it can be. Well, no, I mean, it's funny, but it confuses me too.
Yeah, I hear you.
So my takeaway from what you just said was every prison is for profit.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
That's a better way of putting it. Yeah.
I think you said that.
You
I
did
thought I
say
was quoting you.
Yeah.
I think I said every prison is a private prison. I like the way you said it better.
Oh, yeah, because people are making money off of it. Are there any other questions? Well, you want to follow up?
Kind of a tough question, but is there any way out of that? Like, they're always going to be for profit, or is there another way? Because it seems like as long as they're for profit, there will be abuses.
Whew.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because in New York, a remarkable woman named Gladys Carrion, who ran the New York system for years, managed to close 22 youth prisons, half of New York's large upstate youth prisons, and working with a broad coalition. Another guy I write about, Vinny Schiraldi, was a big part of it. He was the probation commissioner. So they got a law passed called the Close to Home Law, under which if you live in the 5 boroughs of New York and you go through family court, which is what they call juvenile court, you cannot be sent upstate. Instead, you enter this close to home continuum, which is basically a bunch of interventions starting from being at home with a mentor. And then the most secure end of the spectrum is essentially a locked brownstone. And these are all run by nonprofits. The nonprofits are contracted by probation. So that's better. But Gladys, who is just a very fierce and sharp thinker, said to me recently that she saw her achievement as harm reduction, the ultimate goal, because even though they were run by nonprofits, they were funded by probation, which still constituted a separate system for young people of color, because again, the resources were being provided, but they were being provided by a system that had the power to lock them up. And when you talk to kids, like, you can send a kid to therapy, but if it's your probation officer who sends you, the trust and the confidentiality that you were talking about just aren't there. So I think close to home is probably the best model we have for what it looks like to hand control over these kids over to nonprofits. But I also have a chapter called Smaller, Closer, Nicer, which looks at this locked brownstone. And it's got a control room, it's got a Sally port, it's got hundreds of cameras, it's got a staff member who watches the kids when they sleep. Like, just once you lock a building, it kind of turns into a prison. So it's a very complicated question that you're asking. And I'm just not sure what the answer to it is.
I do want to, it's a 341. And I want to remind people that Nell's amazing book, we have 10 copies for sale here, Bookends and Beginnings. Got some advanced copies for you all. If you're interested, obviously you don't have to purchase to have attended this as a public library, but as a courtesy, we brought it here. And I also wanted to let you know about, if you're interested in some action that you can take, every year, the American Friends Service Committee and the Final Five campaign that Patrick was talking about will do an event around Christmas time called Loud and Lit. And people show up in their cars, and they're, they dress their cars with lights, and they make a lot of noise with bells and tambourines and horns and whatever you can think of to make noise. And we go outside of the juvenile detention center and we try to get their attention, just so they can look out their windows and see all the people out there who care about them. And I went to one of these and it was incredibly moving. The hands that you see in the windows, they put their hands in the windows. Some of them were really small. So I would encourage you. I'm going to let you know. Oh, my phone just fell asleep again. Okay, so the information, if you're interested, is December 18th at 5:30 p.m. Loud and Lit is doing a protest to close the final 5 juvenile detention facilities in Illinois. There will be a rally outside of the Lake and Western facility, and then a car caravan to 1100 South Hamilton. And that rally will be outside of the JTC. If you'd like to join us, if everyone here registered for this event, I will also include that information in a follow-up email for you so that you don't have to memorize everything I just said. But just know that's what that is when it comes to. So if there are any final questions or comments or concluding ideas that you'd like to leave us with,
Well, Patrick said his notes. I'm going to just throw out a little ad, which is that this movement isn't over and I remain interested in it. So I'm continuing to look at it on Substack. If you're interested, it's nellbernstein.substack.com. And I will say that I just wrote down 3 or 4 ideas based on what Patrick was talking about that I want to follow up on. And Patrick, I'll probably reach out to you about those.
I'd love it. The title for today's talk was Youth Liberation. And I really appreciate that language. And again, and Heather totally put my mind into this headspace just thinking about the holidays.
Yeah, one of the questions I was going to ask was, youth incarceration is a hard topic to engage, much less to devote one's life to. How do you talk about it in mixed company, say at Thanksgiving?
Yeah. And I don't know, whatever reason, that question really got my mind spinning.
Good.
And I think it's really important that we do talk about these things. And, I just shocked all of you in saying that, prior to this proposal in Illinois being enacted, we could lock up 10-year-olds. I mean, we all know a 10-year-old. And we all can picture what a 10-year-old in handcuffs looks like. It's terrifying. I've seen 10-year-olds in handcuffs. It's terrifying. And if we say, even to our, aunts and uncles in Jackson, Mississippi, 22 states in this union have no minimum age of prosecution, right? 14 states have no minimum age of pretrial detention. 12 states have no minimum age of prison commitment. Like, that should shock people. And I think it does, actually. I think it really does. I think it shocks a lot of people. Like, what are you talking about? Actually, I can't tell. One of my family members, a lawyer, really accomplished attorney. When I started talking to him about what I was going to do post law school, he was like, "Oh, we have a youth prison system?"
Right.
He had no idea. He'd been practicing law for 45 years. He had no clue we had a youth prison system. One of the most accomplished attorneys in the state of Illinois.
Because we don't call them prisons, we call them academies and ranches and boys' schools and
Sure.
Naval Academy.
Sorry about the dog.
I think there's so much information people just don't know, and I think it really shocks them. So I would encourage people to talk about this at Thanksgiving, because I think that we need to convert some more folks to thinking about treating children as children, not as many adults, and thinking about how we can build the communities of hope and restoration. So. Yeah, that's my goal.
Now, how about you? How are you going to talk about this at Thanksgiving, or are you allowed to? What is your family? How do you engage your family members in this kind of topic.
You know, it's interesting. I'm thinking about a fight I had with a cousin at Thanksgiving years ago when I was working on burning down the house. He thought that closing these places was a really bad idea. But as we argued, what turned out to be true was that one of his best friends from high school had killed another one of his friends from high school. And that got me the hell off my soapbox pretty quickly. Uh, I think I don't think it does us any good to pontificate at the Thanksgiving table, because I don't think I've ever been in a room socially or promoting a book or in any other instance where someone has not been personally touched by crime or incarceration. My first book was about children whose parents are incarcerated. Everywhere I went, somebody came up afterwards and told me about a family member. This system just has tentacles everywhere. So personally, I'm not going to bring it up again at Thanksgiving with these same cousins, but I think, you know, I think it just requires some sensitivity to what a deeply personal this is, whether you've been touched by crime, whether you've been touched by incarceration. And like Patrick said, we all know a 10-year-old. I think if you do feel like maybe you want to change a family member's mind, that heart approach is the way to go. There's a man named Bart Lubau, who's one of my mentors and has done tremendous work in philanthropy on this issue, who talks about something he calls the My Child test. That whatever intervention you're considering on behalf of or against another child, just ask yourself, if this were my child, would this be appropriate? And if the answer is no, that intervention can't stand. I wouldn't put it in quite such a abstract way, but I think helping people to see it through the lens of themselves as a parent, as somebody who used to be a teacher, as an aunt, as an uncle, you know, whatever your relationship is to teenagers is probably the way to open things up a bit.
I like that. Yeah, it's a topic that requires a lot of sensitivity.
Yeah.
I don't know though, Heather, like you really got me when you described those small hands at the window. I feel like if that's a story that were you to tell it at a Thanksgiving table.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just might.
Yeah.
I started doing it 2 or 3 years ago, and I still have adhesive on the back of my car because I can't get it. That makes it. Book tape. We dress up our cars really cool. We put on a show for them. Anyway,
It's about, I think, I love that. Pontificating never works.
No.
But I think, again, like bringing in stories, that little hand. And do you know that most states we can lock up 9-year-olds? Like, I think it's just, you know, it's not even converting your Trump uncle. It's even just, you know, educate
like people who don't know.
Yeah, people who don't know.
Nonsense.
People who don't.
Yeah, it's important to talk about it. Yeah, so please talk about it with your friends. My parting gasp. I really appreciate everybody showing up for this and engaging so thoughtfully in the conversation. And thank you, Nell, for this incredible book that you've written and all of the books that you've written and how much time and care you put into this subject. And obviously, Patrick, for showing up for these kids every single day and working with them and working hard and doing the right thing and spreading the word of how it can be. So
Thank you, Heather, for putting this together.
Yeah.
Yeah, and good to see you again.
Good to see you again.
all right, that concludes our event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.